Thank you, Anita. My talk today, I'm going to talk about making density great, and it's a toolkit for 21st century cities. And this is something that came up in the course of our work designing buildings, but we've been increasingly interested in urbanism, and particularly in Asia and rapidly developing Asia. And I think there's quite a few showpiece cities around Asia which look fantastic, they work fantastically, for instance Hong Kong or Shanghai. But many of the cities are going through what we call urban puberty. So they're growing too quickly, they're gangly, they're ugly, they're angry, they're behaving badly. So we're working in a lot of contexts, like in Bangladesh, in Mumbai, in Thailand, and you get this enormous differential between the way some people are living and the way other people are living. And in a way, we think there's an opportunity in these cities which haven't reached their mature form yet, that they can leap technology. So rather as it happened with mobile phones, where some countries have gone from shouting across the village to each other to mobile phones without ever putting in landlines. We think some of these cities can leap from really quite terrible environments, even though they may be very vibrant and lively. And this is the kind of context you have in Mumbai. We're doing projects there where I think everyone's aspiration through movies, through television, is really to live a Western suburban lifestyle. But in this tiny peninsula with 30 million people on it, it's quite impossible that that kind of lifestyle will even fit. And I think as we go into the 21st century, we're coming up against limits all the time, limits of space, limits of food, limits of energy. That kind of lifestyle really doesn't fit into the growing future of Asia. Here's a view of Singapore. So I think the solutions of the 20th century, which was modernism, were really about breaking things down into components. You took a very connected village, then you separate out industry into one area, you put housing in another area, you put commerce in another area, and then you perfect those elements. And we're sort of at the end game of that now, where a housing development, you maximize it, you increase it, but as density goes up, I think the quality starts going down. So through our projects, we've developed what we think is a bit of a toolkit for the 21st century. So we're operating the idea of creating prototypes for this city of the future, as something we've called prototypology. And interestingly to us, as we try and implement these designs, we come up against a whole lot of roadblocks. And what we've realized is cities, and even new cities, master plans for entire new cities, are really 20th century master plans. The planners are imagining 20th century buildings, and they're the buildings that we see all around us today. So they're, the apartment tower, they're the retail podium with an office block on top, they're the factory building. And if planners are working with these components, and these components were really perfected in the 20th century, no matter how interesting the city plan is going to be, it's being built out of out-of-date components. So first thing we thought is, actually, if we're up against limits, and we're talking about limits of space, limits of resources, we can't keep spreading because we have this limited footprint on the Earth. We need buildings to be, and city plans to be, in a sort of both-and situation. So we're in modernism in the 20th century. You say, oh, this is residential. We think in the future things might have to be many things at once. So this is a scheme, a sort of speculative scheme we did for Singapore, imagining global warming, and we had to protect against quite a high sea level rise. That Singapore, which currently imports all its energy, almost all of its food, that this would now be where we had to shrink Singapore's food, water and energy footprint to the size of the island. So this is basically the whole coastline has been turned into a giant reservoir barrage wall to keep the rising sea levels out. And this development is a tidal power plant. So Singapore doesn't have very good access to sustainable forms of energy, but it does have quite high tides that go up and down. So the idea is the water rushes in and out of this artificial inlet, and there's a turbine at the narrow mouth where the water goes in and out. But it's also an apartment complex, it's also a recreational area. It would also incorporate all kinds of multi-use things. So it's a power generation, it's flood protection, and it incorporates all the functions of a city. The next idea we think is that we need high density to not grow beyond the city's limits and to allow growth within our limits. But we have to have high density, high amenity. So this is a scheme in China for a high-rise office block. So the idea is that within the block itself, you have this kind of high amenity areas. You're not relying on the city outside to provide this amenity. And this idea of density is that if we only keep building functional areas, we keep building offices and we keep building residences, but we don't build parks, we don't build recreation areas, inevitably our quality of life will decline. But if, as we're going into this high density mode, we think about adding amenity at the same rate or even a greater rate than we have currently, you can actually anticipate a situation where our cities are both denser but have actually more amenities than they do now. And so this idea too that we have to really actively move towards three-dimensional urban planning. So currently most planning is done two-dimensionally. There's some minor aspects where things have entered the third dimension, but we think in order to achieve this high density, high amenity situation, city plans are going to have to start setting all kinds of planning ideas that go quite high into the third. This is a scheme I'll show a little bit more later, where we propose a Singapore that's 9 times as dense as Singapore is now. But basically, to do a kind of city like this that was hyperdense, you would have to set street levels, for instance, way up in the air that every new development had to connect into. This is a proposal we've made for a new city in Java. And so here we were thinking about actually a rainforest. If we're going to make maximum use of our energy, something that's really inspiring to look at is a rainforest where the trees have grown up to maximize the sunlight at the top, and then you have all kinds of subsequent uses as you come down that have less use for energy. So here we have a solar canopy that covers the whole city. Beneath that you have a layer of agricultural for growing vegetables because they need diffuse light rather than direct light. We have apartments and other offices coming down. Then you have a really interesting ground plane, which in this case we're actually running a tropical forest all the way through the city. So we're not displacing the forest, we're kind of interweaving in 3 dimensions a forest with the city. And that's the kind of environment within the city, so you can have it's a fantasy, but like tropical tapirs, endangered species, hornbills flying through the city and coexisting together with people. So a primary idea behind this high density, high amenity is the need to have multiple ground levels. So this is a school we did in Singapore. It's actually got 3 major levels through the development. It's the green project in the middle. Halfway up the building we have a full level of the whole floor plate, which is where the students can assemble and play sports and do various things. And then on the roof we actually have a 400-meter running track and a playing field. So by consciously sort of thinking of this idea of multiple ground levels, although it's such a high density school in the middle of the city, it actually has really large areas for the kids to play. So through this, we've been playing with ideas of sky gardens, sky streets, sky villages. So this was a project from 2000, a competition we didn't win, but it was a very high density development and has streets every 5 floors through the development leading to the apartments around. This is a public housing project in Singapore. So this was large development, 960 apartments, and we felt it was really, once you get into these large figures, you need to do something to deal with the scale. So we developed 12 villages of 80 apartments each. So each apartment is identified with this village and shares a common space. So each village has a sort of village square and village garden where But all these dwellers can come and get to know each other, they can hold events there, they can walk their dog. And the idea is, as you come from your lift to your apartment, you pass through this space and you look down into it. And hopefully the outcome is that as people pass through this space every day, it functions very much like a street in a village, and people will start to get to know their neighbours and say hello, rather than the typical high-rise situation where you just don't know any of your neighbours, even though you're all living very close together. And then, rather than having penthouses on the top that are given to the wealthiest people because it's public housing, we thought it's really nice if there's a big public park on the top. So here, there's a 300-metre route through the top of the building, and everyone can enjoy the fantastic views. Next one we thought is topographic architecture. So we realized these as it gets more and more dense, people get a very hemmed in and feeling, because somehow high density buildings are very overwhelming and very overpowering. But we realized people really love high density landscapes. Hong Kong is a great example. You've got mountains hanging over you everywhere, but they provoke a very different response than buildings do. So we thought, okay, if we're dealing with large lumps of buildings, maybe we can just turn them into landscapes. So this is a hotel in Singapore that we finished a couple of years ago. And here we thought, rather than having a basement car park, which is something that is an energy hog, you've got to light them 24 hours a day for their entire life of the building. You've got to pump air through them 24 hours a day for the life of the building. Much better to take the car park out, but car parks are ugly lumps of building. But if we turn it into a kind of Chinese grotto of romantic gardens, maybe a car park's not such a bad thing in the city. Apartment tower in a complex in Mumbai, where we had an even more enormous car park holding about 15,000 cars. And it would have been just a terrible neighbour for it. It's surrounded by developments of different size, but a lot of them look into this car park. So instead we've created a 5-hectare park out of the car park. So we thought, well, how do you measure, like if we're going into the super high density, how do we make sure that it doesn't go the usual way of developers where they take everything profitable and they remove everything non-profitable? So we thought in the city of the future, it's good to have some indices where you can actually measure and score buildings against each other. So generosity index is something we thought might be quite interesting. So you characterize a building or a development as a person, and you think, what kind of person would the building be? Is it a friendly, open person who does things for you when you do things for them? Or is it actually kind of an asshole? And I think many buildings, if you turn them into people, you would find out they're kind of psychopaths or assholes. They grab everything they can. They keep everybody away. They really behave quite badly. So for instance, in our hotel project, we thought we started thinking, how do we make it generous? So for people this is the public footpath past the hotel, but it becomes something where people can participate in the kind of experience of the hotel. They enjoy the water, they enjoy the trees, the gardens, even though they're just walking past the building. Next one is community plot ratio. So developers are very fond about talking about plot ratio, like how much buildable area did they create compared to the area of the site. And then developers talk about efficiency. So they say, oh, my project's 95% efficient, meaning I only wasted 5% of the area on non-functional uses as lift lobbies or corridors. But we thought if we start talking about these generosity plot ratios, so a community plot ratio would be how much community space you have in a project that isn't allocated privately to one tenant or owner or another. So School of the Arts, although it's a school, we've looked at our actual brief that we got from the government and then how much we actually provided. So we actually achieve a plot ratio for that of about 0.9, I think. So almost the entire site is repeated as community space additional to the brief. This is the mixed-use development with the old people's home in it. So this one you can see has community space through the whole building, achieving a very high community plot ratio. Next one we thought would be interesting is an ecosystem services score. So If we're thinking that buildings at the moment are basically ecosystem, sucks, they're throwing out carbon, they're throwing out pollution that the ecosystem in the rest of the world has to try and deal with. So if we can look at actually measuring this and then seeing, can we go positive in terms of, is my building starting to perform ecosystem services? So does it have enough planting on it that it's starting to deal with some carbon dioxide? Is it actually treating the pollution through absorption by the plants? And then another kind of ecosystem service, I think, is the building hosting a city ecosystem. So how much is your building actually helping birds, animals, insects actually find a home? Because if our cities keep growing and our ecosystem keeps shrinking, our ecosystem just simply can't provide these services, and there will be no space left for functioning ecosystems. So, for instance, on our hotel, this is part of this landscaping on top of the car park, but these kind of more diverse landscapes, rather than clipped hedges or sort of flowering plants in pots, are starting to support animal life. And what's really nice for us is we've even found squirrels coming up here from the city streets, a whole lot of bird species, butterflies. And so actually measuring these and saying, this building has a high ecosystem score, that building has a really poor ecosystem score. Green plot ratio is something we talk about. So this is how many vegetated surfaces there are in relation to the size of your land. So this is a project we did in China, a hotel, Intercon in Sanya. So here we easily achieve 100% green plot ratio. So you can see the entire site is garden, even though it's got a 350-room hotel underneath it. At the Park Royal in the hotel in Singapore, we achieved 200%. So this is really interesting to us. This is now saying I can have a very dense city, but I can have twice as much garden as if I didn't build a building at all. So this kind of high-rise garden is really something interesting. And was a really nice illustration for us too is this building fronts a park. So although our site is half the size of the park, we actually have as much vegetation inside our building next to the park as there is in the park itself. And now we're doing a project in Singapore where we're achieving 700% green plot ratio. So now we have 7 times as much planting as if the site was left empty. So this is a hotel, and it incorporates both a fully planted 60-story facade as well as 3 full levels of gardens as you go up. The final vision is something where we thought, okay, let's speculate way into the future and let's push this idea as far as we can. So can we make high density, high amenity? So Singapore is currently 5 million people on 700 square kilometers, so it's one of the densest nations on Earth. So we thought, okay, let's give ourselves a challenge. We'll make a second Singapore and stick them all on these little islands off the size of Singapore. So basically 9 times as dense as one of the densest cities in the world. And so the idea is we don't even bother sort of reclaiming land, but have this matrix, 3-dimensional matrix that joins together some of the islands. And what we did, we used actually components of all our various buildings. But the idea here is that this 3-dimensional matrix is actually a sort of self-sufficient city. It has transport running through it. It has retail shops. It has energy generation. It has farms. You can see in the background stadiums, wind turbines. And so this is actually, it's basically 4 times as dense as Manhattan Island, 9 times as dense as Singapore. And we think it is possible to envision a kind of high amenity life. And for us, that's quite interesting. And something that if we keep working with these 20th century components, we simply can't achieve a good lifestyle, I think, at the kind of densities we may have to deal with in future. So for us, I mean, it's obviously not implementable at the moment, and there's all kinds of social and political and practical ways you would have to implement this. But if we keep going the way we're going, we're definitely just going to get to super congestion. And we think it's really interesting to start this conversation. What kind of super high densities should we be building in the future? Thanks.